we have for many hundreds of years been torn in terms of who we identify with, which side we take on the conquest when the Romans come to Britain. And there have been those for many, many hundreds of years who have seen the Romans as delivering progress and law and order and really history itself. The coming of the Romans is the beginning of modernity, is the beginning of society. And for some people, this is basically a good thing. Of course, the Roman Empire was violent, rather brutal. There were mad, bad emperors. There were appalling cruelties that we wouldn't countenance today. But still, the Romans are like us. They believe in law, and they believe in property, and they believe in technology. And the whole modern edifice of society which we enjoy is founded on their contribution.
Hello, I'm Zeb Links, editor at Aspects of History. Roman Britain might appear a staid topic at first glance, one littered with the usual headliners and the iconic events: Julius Caesar's brief expeditions, Claudius's conquest, Boudicca's revolt, and Agricola's northern campaigns. But dig deeper, the narrative is not quite how it seems, especially in light of archaeological discoveries, the continued challenges of interpreting an ancient past, and the shifting ways generations of Britons have come to understand the Roman occupation. This week on the Aspects of History podcast, I'm joined by historian and author Ferdinand Addis to discuss his new book, Conquest, A History of Roman Britain. Our conversation ranges from Iron Age hill forts and ancient DNA to imperial ideology, national identity. Ferdy also discovers his approach to writing history, the importance of landscape and place, and why the Roman conquest remains one of the defining encounters in British history. Next week on the pod, we turn our attentions across the Mediterranean and back a few centuries to ancient Greece, namely a certain Alexander. Edmund Richardson joins me to discuss his sweeping novelistic account of the Macedonian king's life and campaign. His retelling is as cinematic in its depiction as it is sumptuous in its cultural detail and fascinating source material. But for now, settle in for this discussion on Roman Britain with Ferdinand Addis. Welcome, Ferdy, to the Aspects of History podcast. Brilliant to have you join me.
Thanks for having me.
So, your latest title, Conquest, A History of Roman Britain, was released a couple of days ago by Head of Zeus. It's a dramatic saga that ranges from prehistoric evidence of life in Britain all the way to Caesar's forays, colonization under the imperial system, and then kind of right up until the present day, and how we Brits still live among the legacy of the invasion.
This is it's rather embarrassing. It reveals how much I was subject to what they used to call mission creep. It was meant to be just a history of the conquest, the Roman conquest of Britain, quite a nice, discreet, contained story. Julius Caesar, Claudius, maybe Agricola. But as I started to sort of chew on the subject, as you do, you get your subject, you start worrying it, gnawing it between your teeth. And it started to feel like the only way to really make the story make sense was to go broader. And as I started going broader, I went broader and broader and broader. And suddenly, how can you explain, for example, how can you explain what Julius Caesar is doing in Britain in 55 BC? Very eccentric place to be. Without explaining what the Roman Republic is, what his rivalry with Pompey, the whole Roman model of war making and empire building, of expansionism. And so after a while, what emerged was the idea of the Roman conquest of Britain as a sort of focus through which, a focal point at which all these enormously long strands and currents of history come together into a great crisis, an encounter between two hostile, that's complicated, but two opposing forces. So yeah, no, your description is right, I'm afraid.
But I mean, yeah, why the need to write this book now? I mean, I kind of approached it with the idea of it being quite a Roman Britain being quite a, well dug up, fairly, staid topic.
Well, that's right. Almost no corner of the Roman Empire has been more dug up than Britain, Roman Britain. And the textual basis for histories of Roman Britain is fairly narrow. There's not a ton of literary evidence. There's a lot of Tacitus, and then Julius Caesar's own account, obviously, and then beyond that, it's a bit scrappy. But so the sort of beats of the story: Boudicca's revolt, Caesar's invasions, Claudius invades. These are reasonably familiar, I think. I mean, people who are into history have often encountered the story in outline before. I think the reason it turns out to be surprisingly fun and fruitful to write about is because not only is there this sort of very, very rich, deep time context that you can draw upon to make that familiar stories rather come to life, but also the archaeology keeps changing, and it's way more dynamic than I had particularly expected going in. The big headline here is the ADNA revolution of the last 10 years. That has, in large part rewritten the prehistory of Europe, or at least is rewritten too strong? I don't know. It's been a very major change since 2015, and that has a bearing on the story of Roman Britain too, in a way that I tried to get to in the book. But also, it's just miraculous the things that people keep discovering. A new hoard here, a new helmet there. The archaeology is very alive, and it's very alive, and it's very contested. That's another thing that I think people don't necessarily expect from the outside. The reading of a site, say Maiden Castle, where there's this very famous reading that Mortimer Wheeler did in the, gosh, I've forgotten the date of it, but mid 20th century reading of a war cemetery at Maiden Castle, where they found what was for a long time believed to be a British skeleton with a Roman ballista bolt embedded in its spine. And this was the great figure for the violence of the conquest. Mortimer Wheeler wrote this wonderful, rather vivid account of the Romans storming up the hill, chopping Britons into bits, impaling them with ballistas and what have you. Anyway, it turns out that ballista bolt is British, not Roman at all. The cemetery is much more complicated. Evidence of, somewhat eccentric burial practices extending over some unknown duration. The whole story falls to pieces, in short. And for me, that's quite exciting. It means that the ground is always treacherous. You're never very secure. Even what looks like a very scientifically grounded archaeological picture of the past can be turned on its head when one find changes its value. Or does that make sense?
Definitely. No, I like that idea of reading a site like you'd read, the Annals of Tacitus.
Yeah, and you do. You have to read sites in a sophisticated way, and people always bring their own preconceptions about history to the archaeology. Archaeology admits of many, many different interpretations. If you think that history was very, if you think that the past looks a certain way, you read all the archaeology in the light of that prior, if you will. This is something that I've tried not to get too caught up in technicalities in the book. That's not the kind of book this is supposed to be. But I hope that I've been able to show how strangely mutable and I don't know, to me, thrillingly up for grabs, the interpretation of the evidence is.
So following on from the idea of that, site being read, I think one of the kind of great triumphs of the narrative is how you relate the chronology to kind of an element or a feature of the landscape. I think visceral was one of the designations in the blurb that caught my eye, and it's a very physical account. Are you a writer who needs to go and spend time at the locations you're describing, or are you kind of satisfied with building a mental picture as best you can and running with it?
I would describe myself as a creature of the library. I get a positively impure thrill from a rolling stack. Find me among the journals, humming to myself happily. That's my natural environment. Or failing the library in my little attic, which you see me in here. It's a slightly cave-dwelling existence, I can't deny.
It's got nice chiaroscuro going on.
yes, right, that's it. So no, I'm not a great sort of strider of fields. Somewhat to my regret, there's an archaeologist whose name is going to not quite come to mind. It might be Yates, who was a great believer in the value of striding the ramparts of a hill fort and letting the landscape work on you, a sort of qualitative, phenomenological archaeology. And I like that idea, but it's not my strength. But that said, I really wanted in the book to keep the story anchored in concrete instances, in real places, real material, real artifacts. I think, I think by assembling a series of particularities, you can tell a story that means much more than if you reside in the realm of airy theoretical discussion. So I was very keen to try to take us to the White Cliffs of Dover, or to Bath, or to the Wall, Danebury Hill Fort, which is great, by the way. That's actually my all-time favourite rampart to stride around. My second chapter 2, is called Earth, and this is one of the conceits of the book. Is that each chapter has a sort of material title, which serves as both a theme and a sort of locator. It's hard to put it. But I was very proud of that chapter 2, Earth, because I thought that quite often in discussions of history, you forget to look down at the terrain on which the battles are being fought and for which the battles are being fought. You forget to consider the nuances of each sort of hill or valley. I became obsessed with the geography of Britain, the subtleties of different soil types, which you can farm better or worse. The chalk uplands that are more hospitable to a light Iron Age plough, versus the heavy clays of the Weald, say. You could study it endlessly. That just simply the island of Britain. And study it in terms of its agricultural geography, in terms of its communications geography, the fordability of rivers, good landing spots, the direction of wind. I don't know. I mean, does this interest you at all? For me, this is all. I love
exactly.
This stuff.
Yeah. So I actually picked your book as one of my summer reads, which was the episode last week, and I said it was Macfarlane-esque.
Oh, nice! That's very high praise.
Go about it, but I mean, that idea of writing about a place. You've written extensively about the city of Rome in your previous book, and kind of Conquest is similar in the fact it goes from day dot all the way through. You go from kind of Remus to Fellini. Talking kind of historiography, then is it? Do you have to? I mean, we slightly touched on this, but do you feel the urge to be exhaustive? Retrospectively, progressively. I mean, how do you pick your material and sift through, obviously, is a lot for Rome, especially, probably more so than Britain.
There's so much for Rome. That was very hard. I do it in a very unscientific way, I would say. There are just things in history that really speak to me, that resonate somehow. And with Rome, if I can turn to that for a minute, it wasn't until chapter 8 or 9 that I realized what it was that had promoted certain stories into the book. I thought, God, every single person I write about dies. They die, yet they fail, and then they die. Sometimes the failure is the dying, sometimes they fail, then die. But in every case, I was drawn to stories of exile, of vaulting ambition undone by grim circumstance or petty obstacles. So yes, to answer your question, it's an unscientific process, and these are not scientific books. I want to make that clear, and I think it's worth defending a bit as well. If in this modern age, there's an idea that the book is above all a medium for information, and that with respect to podcasts, this is the sort of podcast view of history. That you, the history enthusiast, are just trying to take on board factual information about the past. Just ingest it as much as possible until you swell up with facts. And I, of course, I love a fact. I love guzzling facts and swelling up. But I think in the end, that can be a slightly dry diet. And there must be a place for encounters with history that are more personal, that somewhat more sinuous, I suppose, less direct. Encounters with history that treat history as a text to be responded to artistically, almost emotionally. And maybe in the end, that's what I'm trying to do: is grapple with history as a person, and try to convey a little bit of what it means to me, and what it may mean to all of us to have to exist in history, to have to live in a city like Rome, which is extremely burdensome, historically speaking, surrounded by statues and immortal ghosts. Cicero and Caesar striding around all over the place. The Romantics were very tormented by this. And with Britain too, I think I became obsessed with people who find themselves in a historical predicament, who find themselves facing enormous forces, 1,000-year currents that have led to some extraordinary circumstance. An army of Romans shows up on your doorstep. Take Calgacus, the great Caledonian chieftain who fights a battle against Agricola at the end of the world. And the Caledonians have been farming their little stretches of fertile coastline for many hundreds of years, fairly untroubled. 1 year, an army of Romans appears, starts burning your villages, harvesting your crops, carting off your women. How can you understand that? That comes out of nowhere. It's incomprehensible. A force larger than, all your tribes, all your kingdoms, whatever polity you may be accustomed to as a Caledonian, is nothing next to the Roman Empire. The society that you're facing is articulated in a way that you can't fathom. It has bureaucracy. It has, vastly expanded literacy. It has roads that can take a messenger from London to Rome inside 2 weeks. And there you are, you're the chief of some little valley. in Moray or Perth. What do you do with that? You join the battle line, you wave your sword around if you are lucky enough to have one. You run at the Romans and you die. And what does that mean? I mean, that's a human question. That's an artistic question. What does that mean? That tens, hundreds, thousands of such people charged a line of Romans and died? Does it mean anything? Is it just atoms churning in the void? Maybe. That's the question that really animates my book and me, as a writer. Which may all sound quite eccentric, but that's the best answer I can give you.
No, I like it. Very good. So yeah, I mean, we begin with Julius Caesar's invasions in 55, 54, and those quite short-lived hops across the Channel. How crucial were those early expeditions? I mean, how much interaction had there been in the run-up to Caesar's landing? And kind of what changed in the intervening years between then and Claudius?
Yeah, well, this is one of those, fairly contested questions, actually. How much does Julius Caesar's expedition matter, his two expeditions? Before those expeditions, there has been, Caesar liked to say that when he sailed his army to Britain, he was essentially sailing off the edge of the known world. He was sailing into terra incognita. It might have been dragons out there. Who knows? That, of course, is not true. There were continental traders visiting Britain for hundreds, thousands, really, of years before that. Britain has always been connected to the continent. However, Britain had not encountered the hard power of Rome. Britain had felt Rome as a sort of economic force prior to Caesar's invasions. It had largely mediated by Massilia, which was the great trading city of the late Iron Age in the West. So for the Britons, Caesar is a shock, and I think you can see the effects of that shock in the 100 years that follow. In that time, during that century, the Britons do not forget about Rome. Rome is suddenly much closer than it was before. Roman armies are just on the other side of the Channel. The trade that they used to do, the Britons, by the way, here, of course, when I say the Britons, I don't mean all the Britons. There is no monolithic entity called the Britons. We're talking about individual tribes doing different things. But there were Britons who traded across the Channel with Gaul, especially with the inhabitants of Brittany, we think, and Normandy. There was a sort of established Atlantic route. And all that trade, of course, was now being done with people under Roman domination, people who were in the Roman Empire. What that means precisely is a little bit more slippery than I think we always understand, but still, people who belonged now to Rome. The bit of evidence that we have for the shifting, for the difference that this makes to the Britons, especially of the south, is their coins. There's a wonderful book which I owe a lot to, and I hope I've made that debt sufficiently clear, called Coins and Power by John Crichton, who I'm an enormous fan of. And he really rewrote, I think, our picture of the late pre-Roman Iron Age between Caesar and Claudius, where, it had been imagined that between Caesar and Claudius, the Britons revert to being rather stereotypical Britons, still, painting themselves blue and growing long moustaches and, pretty wild, the way Caesar portrayed them. But if you look at the coins, you can see that, in fact, there's this very determined effort by at least some stratum of British society to plug themselves into the Roman world and the Roman vocabulary of power. You get Augustan imagery on British coins, British gold status, which is extraordinary. You get the Latin word rex for king on British coins. Britons are supposed to be illiterate. They probably are. Why are British kings calling themselves Rex in Latin script on their coins. It's very, very significant that. There are traces of a curule chair. That's one of those sort of rather sacred chairs that Roman magistrates used in a tumulus at Lexden, I think, near Camulodunum, which was the great oppidum of the Trinovantes. What's that doing there? That reads like a sort of symbolic gift from Rome to some compliant king, a rex sociusque et amicus, in the Latin technical vocabulary, meaning a king friend and king ally and friend. So Britain changes a lot, as you would change, having encountered a rather terrifying alien power, against which all your proudly maintained traditions of warfare proved rather useless. So you asked how significant Caesar's expeditions were. Very significant as a shock. We don't know much about the kind of settlement Caesar imposed on Britain. He's not really around to enforce the settlement for very long. He has to deal with the Gallic uprising over the years that follow, and then he has to go back to Rome and fight Pompey, and then he has to get murdered. So busy schedule. Nevertheless, the Roman tradition that says, Caesar's expeditions didn't really achieve much, is largely a hostile historiographical tradition, and we shouldn't necessarily believe it. Britain wasn't all that important to Rome. So we shouldn't infer from the fact that we don't hear very much about it the conclusion that Britain was not, in some sense, squared away by the Augustan regime, by the regime of Augustus and his successors. That's my 2 cents there.
Hello, Zeb here. Please forgive my interruption, but I wanted to let you know that at Aspects of History, we produce a digital magazine featuring articles, interviews, short stories, and book reviews of the best historical writing available. Authors featured including Ben McIntyre, Lucy Worsley, Andrew Roberts, and plenty more. An annual subscription is available for only $9.99. That's pounds or dollars. Yep, you heard that right. That's 6 issues for under £10 or dollars. Head over to aspectsofhistory.com to subscribe, where you can also gift subscriptions. Now back to the show. This slightly follows on. So obviously Great Britain isn't fully conquered, but I think some readers might be surprised by how far up into kind of Aberdeenshire and Moray, as you said, that Agricola gets by the end of the 1st century AD. This idea of imperium sine fine, I mean, you just talked about the kind of influence of over the kings of the tribes, but also the kind of, before, during, after, Rome's influence is being felt, and the kind of cultural echoes that you bring up in the final chapters. I mean, is that what they meant by, well, it's Virgil, right, who coins imperium sine fine?
It's Virgil. It's Jupiter speaking to Aeneas, making his promise. This is what I give to you, empire without end. I think Virgil leaves it somewhat ambiguous what that means. He might well have intended a sort of universal dominion in a rather literal sense. Armies marching where they like, all kings and princes bowing down to the great Augustus. But for me, it's a very rich phrase because it gets at something that I think is really important about the ancient world and about the Roman Empire in particular, which is that it doesn't have, or at least I was about to say it doesn't have an edge. It does have an edge. It has many edges, and the edges are very slippery. They move around rather treacherously, especially treacherously if you're a neighbor. You might think that Rome's boundaries lie rather further away from you than Rome might suppose. But also, the edge of the Roman Empire is not just a question of territory, a question of military zones of control, let's say. There is also this economic influence, this cultural influence. And even just, there are territories over which Rome treats itself as having the right to intervene. You might be a happy German tribe living in the forest and discover to your surprise that Rome thinks it can just tell you who your king is going to be. For example, a great set piece in the book, obviously, is Boudicca's revolt. And part of the genesis of that revolt, per Tacitus and Cassius Dio, is a transition of power from the king of the Iceni, Prasutagus, to his daughters. He's a king at the edge of the Roman Empire. And he, one suspects, regarded himself as being slightly outside the Roman Empire, a friend and ally. When he dies, he wants to leave his kingdom to his daughters. This may not be as strange to him as it seems to the Romans. That was very eccentric by their lights. But the question of women and power in ancient Britain is very live. Anyway, he wants to leave the kingdom to his daughters, and his daughters and their mother, Boudicca, discover to their extreme displeasure and misfortune that Rome doesn't think this is on. Rome thinks that the territory of the Iceni is encompassed within is very much included within the empire, and that Rome is the power that will decide who is king or who is queen or who inherits what. And I think this sort of thing is always happening around the edges of the Roman Empire. So that's part of what Imperium Sine Fine gets at for me, is that Rome is rather bad at acknowledging or at accepting any limit to its power. One last thing to say on this is that looking back, we love to draw maps. And everyone will have seen maps where the Roman Empire is marked in sort of purple or what have you. And it's very neat. It follows a mountain range here or goes down the Rhine there and the Danube. And there's the idea of the frontier, the limes. And this is real. The frontiers are absolutely real military lines. However, we shouldn't accept we shouldn't be misled by our maps into thinking that the Roman Empire simply stops at the frontier, or that it runs neatly up to the frontier. In truth, there's a lot of bleed in both directions. Roman settlers are always moving out beyond the frontiers. Rome is always planting outpost forts deep in what should be barbarian territory. Conversely, large areas within the empire fall into disuse. They become deserted. They are settled by incomers from beyond the frontiers. Maybe the real consistent theme here is everything is messier and more complicated than it looks from far away.
Talking of messy and complicated, the kind of the legacy of Rome, I think, remains awfully complicated, and I think it's rather less acknowledged than it might otherwise be. I mean, I kind of liked how in Earth, as you say, chapter 2, you talk about these migrations, and I obviously 1066 stands out as this date, but obviously Caesar and Claudius, it feels more cyclical. But that kind of cultural legacy, is there a choice to be made about how we view the occupation of Britain now? How do you think it informs society today in this country?
Well, my thesis is that we have for many hundreds of years been torn in terms of who we identify with, which side we take on the conquest when the Romans come to Britain. And there have been those for many, many hundreds of years who have seen the Romans as delivering progress and law and order and really history itself. You know, the coming of the Romans is the beginning of modernity, is the beginning of society. And for some people, this is basically a good thing. Is it the book 1066 and all that, which wants to characterize all historical events as being a good thing or a bad thing? That's my dim recollection.
I think so.
But it's a very natural, it's a very sort of human impulse, isn't it? Was it good or bad? We always want to ask. The Romans invaded. Are they the goodies? And some people think yes, yeah. You know, of course, the Roman Empire was violent, rather brutal. There were mad, bad emperors. There were appalling cruelties that we wouldn't countenance today, we like to think. But still, the Romans are like us. They believe in law, and they believe in property, and they believe in technology, and the whole modern edifice of society which we enjoy is founded on their contribution. That is one line. There's a contrary line, which nevertheless accepts the same fundamental premises, which goes something like, the Romans bring all the vices and evils of modernity. They bring capitalism, consumption, a sort of hostile relationship to the earth and her resources. The Britons in this picture lived in harmony with nature in a sort of primordial prelapsarian condition. They ate only what they hunted. They live in a sort of druidic twilight, dancing around Stonehenge occasionally, and painting themselves with magical patterns. And I don't think either of these pictures is really right. But I do think that the dichotomy has been powerful. Has been a powerful engine of dispute and a powerful, an important terrain of ideological contest. Especially maybe since the 18th and 19th centuries. I mean, I would want to consult a really good Victorianist about this, but that for me is where I think you get the Celtic romantic most vividly, Ossian and so forth, versus the sort of Augustan British imperialist. There's a wonderful moment for me, a sort of rich moment towards the end of Queen Victoria's reign, where one feels that they're trying to attempt a synthesis between Celtic romantic nationalism and Roman Romanitas, Roman imperial vigor and orderliness. So you have Highland brigades piping themselves into battle, romantically, but very much for the empire. You have a wonderful statue of Boudicca by, I think it's, I've forgotten which bridge it's by, maybe Vauxhall Bridge. Anyway, there's a lovely Victorian statue of Boudicca, Thomas Thornycroft, galloping through the imperial capital, London, the capital which she herself burned to the ground, slaughtering the inhabitants. Very, very weird statue to erect, but it only makes sense as an attempt to reconcile two battling urges in the national soul. That's my reading of it.
Stirring, I'd say. Yeah,
very stirring.
But what's on the cards now? So, new book or project-wise, what's the next grand topic?
Well, if the fates allow, the next thing I'd like to do is a little biography of Pompey the Great, who is an underappreciated figure, I think. And I'm surprised by how many people don't know who he is at all. I mean, you know who Pompey the Great is, of course, but people, I get a lot of blank looks. But he's such an enigmatic figure, and he exemplifies all my favourite traits in a historical figure, which is to say that he has megalomaniac ambition and vanity and comes totally a cropper and falls flat on his face. And so for me, that's the dream subject. And you could, I can, naturally, I'll try to constrain my natural desire to expand everywhere and end up writing a history of the world. But of course, I won't. And a biography of Pompey the Great would be a book about the fall of the Roman Republic, but also a book about the human desire for greatness and the folly inherent therein. It'd be very rich, but we'll see. We'll see how the logistics work out there.
We look forward to it. Yeah, publishers come calling, I guess. But yeah, so grateful for the opportunity to discuss Roman Britain. So Conquest, A History of Roman Britain is published in hardback by Head of Zeus. You can find the links in the book in the description. So check it out. And yeah, thank you, Ferdy. Yeah, catch you for Pompey next time.
Well, thanks very much.
Thanks so much for listening. Links are in the show notes. Please share with friends and family and keep your eyes peeled for new episodes. And if you want to get in touch, you can through X or email history@aspectsofhistory.com. But until then, thank you and good night.